Stage 3 is where the cage becomes invisible, because once debt is normal and debt is a product, the system still needs one more invention. It needs a gate, a way to decide who gets access, who is safe, who is risky, who gets approved, who gets quietly denied. In the old world, that decision was personal. A banker looked you in the eye. He knew your employer. He knew your family name. Sometimes that was unfair. Sometimes it was corrupt. But it was human. Stage 3 replaces the human with something colder. The file, the bureau, the score. In the United States, this architecture becomes formal. In 1970, the Fair Credit Reporting Act helped standardize consumer reporting. And in 1989, the FACO score popularizes the idea that your financial life can be reduced to a single number. Not your character, not your work ethic, not your future potential. A number. And once a society accepts that number, debt stops being a tool you use. It becomes a behavioral control system. Here's the key. A credit score is not a morality test, it's a predictability test. It measures how reliably you produce cash flow, how consistently you obey the schedule, how safe you are as a payer. And the moment that number becomes your passport, your psychology changes. You stop building a life. You start protecting access. Let me show you what that looks like. A young couple tries to rent a modest apartment. They have stable jobs. They have a baby on the way. But one medical bill from 2 years ago went to collections. The landlord doesn't say, "You seem responsible." The landlord says, "Your file says no." The couple isn't rejected by a person, they're rejected by a model. And when your life is decided by models, you learn a lesson quickly. Don't offend the number. So you pay on time even when it hurts. You keep accounts open even when you don't want them. You carry debt you could wipe out, because you're told closing accounts may lower your score. You hesitate before risk, before quitting, before moving, before telling your boss no, because it's not just your money on the line, it's your permission to participate. That's stage 3. Debt becomes identity, and it scales perfectly. A banker can't manage 50 million borrowers. A score can. Credit bureaus, automated underwriting, instant approvals, instant denials, no chains, no guards, no prison bars, just an invisible rule. If your number drops, your world shrinks. And here's why stage 3 locks perfectly into stage 2. If debt is a product sold to investors, those investors don't just want profit. They want predictable profit. They want yield they can model, cash flow they can forecast, behavior they can depend on. The score manufactures that behavior. It trains a population into measurable, forecastable payers. People love to talk about social credit like it's a foreign dystopia, a system where behavior is scored and rewarded. But notice the uncomfortable similarity. We already built a version of it. We just called it finance. We wrapped it in polite language. We made it feel responsible. We made it feel normal. Stage 3 doesn't need a police officer. It uses a number in your file. Now we move to stage 4. Stage 4 is where the system stops feeling like a set of loans and starts feeling like a treadmill. This is where most people live. And the cruel part is that it doesn't feel like slavery. It feels like adulthood. Mortgage, car payment, insurance, minimum payments, subscriptions. A little balance here, a little balance there. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal, no one forcing you. And yet month after month, year after year, you run. Because the cost of normal life is converted into fixed monthly obligations. Housing becomes a contract. Transportation becomes a contract. Education becomes a contract. Phones become contracts. Even convenience becomes contracts. And once your life is built on fixed payments, you lose freedom in a very specific way. You can't pause. You can't breathe. You can't easily say, "I'm going to slow down for 6 months and rebuild," because your obligations don't slow down with you. They keep coming. Now here's the psychological switch that makes stage 4 so powerful. People stop asking, "Can I afford this?" And they start asking, "Can I make the monthly payment?" That one shift changes everything. You don't buy a car. You buy a payment. You don't buy a phone. You buy a payment. You don't buy a degree. You buy a payment. You don't buy a home. You buy a payment. And once everything becomes a payment, your future income becomes pre-sold. Piece by piece, this is how the treadmill grows without anyone announcing it. A paycheck comes in. Payments go out. Whatever remains is called choice. Now add one more ingredient, fear. Because the moment you're living on payments, you don't fear poverty first. You fear interruption, a layoff, an injury, a divorce, a bad quarter, a single month where the calendar wins. That's when people discover what stage 4 really is. Not debt, dependency. And this is where history gives you the clearest proof that it's a system, not an accident. 2008 happens. Not because debt becomes dangerous. Debt was already dangerous. 2008 is the moment the public briefly sees what stage 2 really means. When debt is packaged, sliced, sold, and spread everywhere, the entire system rests on one fragile assumption. Borrowers will keep paying. When that assumption breaks, the machine doesn't just wobble, it threatens to collapse. So the system is stabilized. Banks are rescued. The collapse is stopped. But the deeper mechanism is not removed, it is protected. And after that, the message becomes quieter and more aggressive. If you want to survive, you must use debt. If you want to keep up, you must leverage. If you want to build wealth, you must borrow. For a while, debt feels like a ladder. When borrowing is cheap and assets rise, debt looks like intelligence. But ladders turn into traps when conditions change. In the 2020s, conditions change. Inflation surges, interest rates rise, monthly payments jump, and the treadmill becomes brutal. And here's the part most people miss. The treadmill doesn't get brutal only because rates rise. It gets brutal because the system quietly changes what normal means. In stage 4, normal life is no longer a set of purchases. It's a stack of obligations, and obligations don't care how you feel. They don't care if you're exhausted. They don't care if your boss is toxic. They don't care if your child gets sick. They just arrive. That's why the modern economy doesn't primarily fear unemployment. It fears interruption. Because interruption breaks the payment chain. And once enough households live on monthly payments, society becomes a machine that must keep households paying. Not once, not twice, every month, for decades. So ask yourself a simple question. What is the most dangerous event in a payment society? It's not a recession as an idea. It's millions of people missing payments at the same time. That's why Stage 4 produces a strange kind of policy. Not policies designed to make people free. Policies designed to keep the payment chain alive. Sometimes that means lowering rates. Sometimes that means raising rates. Sometimes it means stimulus. Sometimes it means support programs. Sometimes it means bailouts. Sometimes it means quiet rule changes most people never notice. But the goal stays consistent. Keep the payment chain unbroken. Now let's talk about a word that sounds boring, but explains everything. Refinance. Refinance is the Stage 4 magic trick. Because when the system wants you to stay on the treadmill, it doesn't need to keep you permanently suffering. It just needs to keep you permanently rolling. Rolling one obligation into another. Rolling one loan into a longer timeline. Rolling one balance forward. Let me make that real. A family buys a home when payments are manageable. Then life gets tighter. A medical bill, a car repair, a new baby. Groceries rise. Insurance rises. They don't get a message that says, "You are trapped now." They get a friendly offer. "We can help you. Lower your monthly payment. Just extend the term." And in that moment it feels like rescue. But relief is not freedom. Relief is the treadmill slowing down for a moment so you can keep running. That's the genius of refinance. It offers rescue without escape. Now look at what happens at scale. You can't afford the house at 30 years? Stretch it. You can't afford the car at 5? Make it 7. You can't pay the credit card? Consolidate. You can't pay the consolidation? refinance again, and every time you do it, the system gets what it wants, not your collapse, your continuation, because continuation is yield, continuation is predictability, continuation keeps the payment chain alive. Now here's the part that makes Stage 4 feel inevitable. People stop asking the old question, can I afford this? And they start asking the new question, can I make the monthly payment? That shift doesn't just change consumer choices, it changes the entire culture. It turns the future into something you rent. Now let's step back, because this pattern is not new. Ancient societies discovered something the modern world tries to forget. Debt can stabilize a society, but too much debt can break it. In the ancient Near East, places like Sumer and Babylon, rulers sometimes declared clean slates. Debt cancellations, release from debt bondage, restoration of lost land. Not because kings were saints, because they were realists. They feared what happens when too many families become trapped. They feared losing their farmers. They feared losing their soldiers. They feared a society where the future is already owned by the past. So they reset parts of the system to keep the system alive. In Sumer, there's even an early word tied to this idea, amagi, often translated as a kind of release from obligations. And later, Babylonian rulers issued debt remission edicts because they understood something modern policymakers rarely say out loud. If the debt overhead gets too heavy, your society doesn't become more productive. It becomes more fragile. Now compare that to the modern world. We don't do jubilees. We do restructurings. We do refinancing. We do relief programs. We do inflation. We do interest rate cycles. We don't wipe the slate clean for ordinary people. We stretch the slate. We make the line longer. That is the modern substitute for the ancient reset. And this is why inflation becomes so important in a debt society. People think inflation is just prices rising. But in a payment economy, inflation changes power. It can quietly erode the value of savings. It can quietly change the real burden of fixed debts. It can quietly push people away from cash and toward assets and leverage. In other words, inflation doesn't just raise prices. It changes behavior. It keeps people in motion. And a system built on payments loves motion. Now let's talk about the most underrated tool Stage 4 uses: rewards, points, cashback, miles. Because the modern system doesn't only lend you money, it bribes you to borrow. It turns borrowing into a game. Swipe, earn, repeat. And at small scales, it feels harmless. A free flight, a little cashback, a discount you didn't pay for. But across an entire population, this is not just finance, it's conditioning. It trains the brain to associate debt behavior with benefits, while hiding the true cost inside interest and minimum payments. That's why Stage 4 is so psychologically effective. It doesn't just trap people with fear, it traps people with virtue. People don't say, I have obligations that own my future. They say, I'm building my credit. They don't say, I'm selling my next decade. They say, I'm investing in myself. They don't say, my survival depends on the payment chain continuing forever. They say, I'm being responsible. This is the genius of Stage 4. It turns dependence into a moral identity. And once dependence becomes virtue, Stage 5 becomes easier. Because Stage 5 is not only laws and bankruptcy rules. Stage 5 is belief. It's when people stop believing escape is realistic. They stop believing debt can be temporary. They start believing debt is the default state of adulthood. And when that belief spreads, the system no longer needs to force the cage. People walk into it, they decorate it, they defend it, because the cage is called normal. Now here's the simplest way to recognize Stage 4 in your own life. Ask yourself this. If your income stopped for 3 months, would your life collapse? Not your lifestyle, not your entertainment, your life, housing, transportation, healthcare, food, the basics. If the answer is yes, then you're not just using credit. Credit is using you. You are living in a system that has pre-sold your future. And it sold it so gently, you were told it was freedom. That's why the treadmill becomes brutal. Because once enough people live this way, there is no easy correction. If the system tightens too hard, people break. If it loosens too much, prices inflate. If it resets completely, institutions panic. So instead, it chooses the path it always chooses. Keep the payment chain alive. At any cost. In any form. And that brings us back to the personal reality of Stage 4. A family that could afford the payment yesterday can't afford the same house today. A young worker who did everything right discovers that the price of entry moved faster than their life did. And here's the uncomfortable political reality of Stage 4. A population with heavy obligations is stable. They show up. They comply. They can be managed. They don't quit easily. They don't strike easily. They don't resist easily. They can't afford to. Debt is soft discipline, not a boot on your neck, a calendar, a due date, a minimum payment, a quiet pressure that whispers, keep moving, keep working, keep paying. Now we reach Stage 5. Stage 5 is where the system makes the exit. Expensive, because in a healthy society, freedom should increase as you age. Work, save, own, reduce obligations, become freer over time. But in the debt slavery pattern, escape becomes frightening. Not impossible, just costly enough that most people won't attempt it. Here's how Stage 5 works. If you try to escape by saving, inflation quietly taxes your savings, so you're pushed toward risk. If you try to escape by investing, you enter markets where timing can destroy you. So you stay anxious. If you try to escape by paying down debt aggressively, you discover the system rewards activity and history, being connected, being measurable, being predictable. So you stay attached, and then the escape hatches start to close. In 2005, the United States passes major bankruptcy reforms that make it harder for many consumers to wipe the slate clean. And for most borrowers, student loans are generally not dischargeable in bankruptcy unless you meet a very high standard. Think about what that means. In earlier eras, bankruptcy was a brutal reset button, but it existed. A last resort exit. Stage 5 doesn't ban escape. It raises the price of escape so high that most people choose the treadmill instead. Now let's make this real with one final picture. Imagine a 22-year-old graduating with debt. They're told it's an investment. They're told it's good debt. But that debt follows them into every decision. Which job they accept, which city they can afford, whether they can take an internship, whether they can start a business, whether they can risk failure. The debt doesn't just take their money, it takes their options. And here is the cold logic behind that design. Once an economy depends on debt growth, true independence becomes a threat. Because a person with no obligations is hard to control. They can quit, they can relocate, they can wait, they can say no, they can refuse. A person without debt can outlast institutions. And institutions hate being outlasted. So the system builds soft walls, not laws that say you must borrow, not police that force you to sign, just incentives and penalties strong enough that most people choose the cage voluntarily. Now go back to the question from the beginning. If everyone is in debt, who are they in debt to? On the surface, banks, lenders, governments, bondholders. But the deeper answer is more revealing. You are in debt to a system that requires your future labor. Debt is a claim on your time. A mortgage is a claim on decades of your work. A student loan is a claim on your early career years. A credit card balance is a claim on your monthly survival. Debt is not just money. Debt is a contract that reaches forward and grabs your future. That's why it feels like a cage. Because it is. Not a cage you see. A cage you schedule. Now here's the line the system never wants you to say out loud. We are living in Stage 4 and drifting into Stage 5. A life built on payments and an exit that gets more expensive over time. Stage 1 normalized debt. Stage 2 turned debt into a product. Stage 3 turned debt into behavior. Stage 4 turned life into payments. Stage 5 made the exit expensive. And once a society reaches stage 5, something predictable happens. People don't just feel stressed, they feel trapped. And historically, when people feel trapped, they stop believing life improves. They stop believing effort leads to freedom. They start believing the game is rigged. That is the psychological breaking point. Because people can tolerate hardship. What they cannot tolerate is hopelessness. So here's the takeaway. This system does not need you poor. It needs you obligated. It needs your future. It needs you running. And once you see that, you'll notice something frightening. The system doesn't punish you mainly for failure. It punishes you for independence, because independence is the one thing it cannot easily price. This is why the debt slavery pattern keeps spreading. This is why it keeps deepening. And this is why more people, in more countries, are starting to say the same sentence. I did everything right, so why do I still feel like I'm drowning? Because the system was built this way. Built to borrow from tomorrow. Built to turn time into money. Built to make obligation feel like normal life. And once you understand that, you stop seeing debt as a personal mistake. You start seeing it for what it really is. A design, a structure, a pattern. And the first step to escaping any cage is recognizing the shape of the bars.